In the spring of 1811, demolition crews working on an abandoned tobacco warehouse in Richmond, Virginia, stumbled upon something that would stain the city's memory for generations. Beneath a layer of rotting floorboards lay 8 identical wooden boxes. Inside each was a man's wedding ring and a small glass vial filled with what appeared to be medicinal powder. The rings carried different names, different dates, but one unnerving similarity. Every single one had belonged to a husband of the same woman, Ruth Holloway. Over the course of 30 years, this refined widow had buried 8 wealthy men, each under circumstances that, through the lens of modern medicine, would later seem chillingly suspicious. The authorities, shaken by the implications, ordered the find locked away from public record. Officially, it was to protect the reputations of prominent families. In truth, it was an attempt to bury a story that could unravel the social fabric of Virginia's elite. For more than 2 centuries, the case has remained hidden in the archives of the Virginia Historical Society. But tonight, we're opening those locked doors to reveal the story of one of America's most deliberate and most feared serial killers. Ruth Holloway's story doesn't begin with murder, but with loss. Loss that would pave the way for a string of deaths no one dared question. Virginia, in 1780, was still reeling from the aftershocks of the Revolutionary War. Along the James River, grand tobacco plantations stood as monuments to the new nation's prosperity. White-columned mansions rose above the fertile fields, their owners, patriots turned aristocrats, savoring their hard-won wealth. Yet behind the polished veneer of victory, the war had left deep scars. Loyalist estates had been seized, fortunes overturned, and powerful new families had risen from the wreckage. It was into this shifting world of opportunity and betrayal that Ruth arrived in Richmond in the autumn of 1782. She was 28, strikingly beautiful, with auburn hair and eyes the pale gray of winter skies. Claiming to be the grieving widow of Captain Jonathan Holloway, a Continental Army officer who, she said, had perished heroically at Yorktown, she spoke of losing everything and seeking a new life in Virginia, a place she had heard was prosperous and genteel. What set Ruth apart wasn't only her beauty. She spoke with the cultured cadence of an educated New Englander, read Latin with ease, and possessed a rare mastery of herbal medicine. In an age when physicians were scarce and remedies unreliable, her skill was priceless. She carried with her a weathered leather journal filled with handwritten cures, a supposed inheritance from generations of family healers. Richmond society embraced her eagerly. The war had left the city short of refined, marriageable women, and Ruth was everything the gentry admired, graceful in conversation, attentive in manners, and able to discuss politics with the men while tending to the ailments of their wives. Within months, she had secured a modest but well-respected home on Clay Street, earning income by tending to the sick among the city's wealthiest families. But under Richmond's polished civility, darker undercurrents swirled. The Revolution had not only made heroes, it had made opportunists. There were whispers of merchants who had secretly supplied the British, planters who had switched allegiances for profit, and leaders who had betrayed fellow patriots for land and gold. These men now walked openly among Virginia's elite, their wartime treachery buried beneath layers of influence and wealth. It was among these powerful and morally compromised men that Ruth began her calculated path. Her charm drew the attention of Richmond's most prosperous figures, tobacco barons, shipping magnates, land speculators, and ambitious politicians. One by one they courted her, married her, and, without exception, died under circumstances that, at the time, seemed tragically ordinary. The first death came less than 6 months after Ruth wed Colonel Edmund Fairfax, one of the city's most prominent tobacco merchants. On a suffocating August night in 1783, Fairfax was found slumped over his desk, lifeless. The cause, recorded by the attending physician, was acute gastric fever. But in the quarters of the enslaved, whispers told a different tale. Fairfax's manservant Jupiter claimed he had been awakened by the sound of moaning from the study that night. Peering through the window, he saw his master clutching his stomach while Ruth stood beside him, offering a steaming cup of tea. Her voice was gentle but firm. "Drink this, my dear Edmund. It will ease the pain." Within minutes of swallowing it, Fairfax convulsed violently, then collapsed. Ruth rinsed the cup in a prepared basin before raising the alarm. The doctor found nothing unusual, just another case of gastric illness, common in Virginia's hot, disease-ridden summers. But what he didn't know, and what Ruth had learned from a disgraced Philadelphia physician named Dr. Marcus Wainwright, was that certain native plants could mimic natural illness, leaving no trace in the body after death. And with that knowledge, Ruth Holloway's quiet reign of terror had begun. Ruth had not only absorbed Dr. Wainwright's methods, she had refined them. Through quiet experimentation, she discovered that blending small quantities of certain plant alkaloids with ordinary medicinal herbs could serve two entirely different purposes. In careful doses, her preparations soothed genuine ailments. But with just the right increase, or the right combination, they became silent instruments of death. Her leather-bound family remedy book was no heirloom of harmless cures. It was a ledger of precision killings disguised as medicine. When Colonel Fairfax was laid to rest, Richmond society gathered in black silks and polished boots, whispering about the tragic loss. Ruth, dressed in deepest mourning, played her role flawlessly, fainting at the graveside, clutching a lace handkerchief as sympathetic friends steadied her. Few noticed how quickly her fortunes had changed. Fairfax's will, penned soon after their wedding, left her a substantial inheritance: the house on Clay Street, land holdings, and a fortune in gold. Her grief did not linger. Barely 3 months later, she was seen in the company of Captain William Randolph, a shipping magnate whose wartime supply runs to the Continental Army had made him one of the most respected men in Virginia. Some remarked at the speed of her recovery, but society was quick to defend her. A widow alone, they reasoned, deserved protection, and Randolph was a man of impeccable honor. What no one in those drawing rooms guessed was that Ruth's choices were never born of romance. Each husband was selected with care, for every one of them had ties to the same clandestine circle, a group of men who, during the Revolution, had secretly aided the British while profiting from the chaos. Fairfax had been their treasurer, the keeper of British gold meant for American traitors. Captain Randolph was another name on her private list. By January 1784, Ruth had become Mrs. Randolph. By September, she was a widow again. The robust sea captain, famous for enduring Atlantic storms without falling ill, was struck down in just 3 days. Dr. Harrison called it bilious fever, but in the slave quarters, a different story took shape. Caesar, a servant in the Randolph home, noted the strange parallels with Colonel Fairfax's end. The sudden stomach pains, the weakness, and the tea prepared only by Ruth's hand. Caesar even found a small vial hidden behind a loose board in the study, a white powder with a faint scent of almonds and bitter herbs. When he quietly showed it to Jupiter, now working for another household, the older man went pale. He'd seen the same thing before, in the Fairfax kitchen, just after the colonel's death. Word spread quietly through the slave community. They began keeping their own record, watching Ruth's habits, noting how she never let anyone touch her locked chest of supplies, how she insisted on mixing all of her husband's remedies herself, and how she took solitary walks in the Virginia woods, returning with baskets of common herbs that no one else was allowed to handle. If her reputation among them grew darker, her standing in Richmond society only climbed higher. Randolph's will left her richer still. and her double tragedy made her a figure of fascination and pity. She was sought after at every gathering, admired for her grace and resilience. Her third marriage came in June 1785 to Judge Thomas Henley, a member of the Virginia House of Delegates and a respected architect of the state's new legal system. Their courtship was brief but ardent. The judge declared Ruth had restored his faith in love after losing his first wife in the war. Society celebrated their union as one of the most prominent weddings of the season. Henley's death, 7 months later, shocked even those accustomed to tragedy. It happened in front of a dozen guests at a dinner party in their own home. The judge had been lively and animated all evening, regaling the table with stories of the constitutional conventions. Then Ruth served him a digestive tonic, she said, from a recipe her late mother had once made for her father. Minutes later, his complexion paled, his speech faltered, and he began to clutch his abdomen. It was the third time Dr. Harrison had been summoned to the bedside of one of Ruth's dying husbands, and though suspicion began to creep into his mind, there was no proof, no sign of violence, no witnesses to any wrongdoing. Ruth had been surrounded by guests during Henley's final hours. The symptoms could have been caused by any number of illnesses common to Virginia's climate. The years that followed saw the same dreadful pattern. In 1787, wealthy plantation owner George Carrington was struck down with what physicians called acute dyspepsia. The next year, merchant Samuel Bradford died of nervous fever. By 1789, banker Edward Custis met his end from gastric apoplexy. Each passing left Ruth wealthier, each funeral performance more elaborate, and each new marriage accompanied by whispers that grew harder to dismiss. It was shortly after Custis's death that another figure reappeared in Richmond, Dr. Marcus Wainwright. The disgraced physician who had once tutored Ruth in Philadelphia rented a small home on the city's outskirts. To casual eyes, he was a man seeking redemption. In truth, he had learned of Ruth's work and saw an opportunity for profit. Caesar, now employed nearby, observed Ruth visiting Wainwright at dusk, always leaving after nightfall. These were no social calls. Wainwright had proposed a partnership. He would supply her with more advanced, untraceable poisons, and in return, she would share a portion of her inheritance from each death. But Wainwright had misjudged her. Ruth's killings were not driven by mere greed. She was working through a list, and there were only 2 names left. Men whose betrayal during the war had cost her everything. Dr. Harrison himself, and the most powerful man in Virginia, Governor Edmund Randolph, the architect of the treason she sought to avenge. The autumn of 1790 brought an unexpected complication to Ruth Holloway's precise campaign of vengeance, a complication in the form of Captain Jonathan Hale. A former Continental Army intelligence officer, Hale had a reputation for noticing patterns others overlooked. Officially, he came to Richmond to resolve property disputes tied to Loyalist confiscations. Unofficially, he was tracking whispers of a shadowy network that had fed British forces crucial American military intelligence during the Revolution. Over months of inquiry, Hale had identified names, men who had betrayed their own cause, yet prospered in the war's aftermath. What caught his attention was that many of them had died in recent years under eerily similar circumstances. The local authorities dismissed the deaths as coincidence, but Hale began to see a deliberate pattern, a methodical removal of players in an old game of treachery. His first solid lead came through a quiet evening with Dr. Harrison. Over dinner, the physician admitted that he was unsettled by the sheer number of prominent men who had succumbed to stomach ailments in recent years, particularly when one woman had been at the center of so many tragedies. Mrs. Holloway, Harrison mused, is perhaps the most attentive wife I've ever seen. She knows remedies, cares for her husbands with great devotion, and yet every one of them dies under her care. If I didn't know better, I might. He stopped himself. Might what? Hale prompted. Harrison shook his head. It's uncharitable to say. But in 30 years of practice, I've never seen such a concentrated string of similar deaths in one family. That night, Hale began digging into Ruth Holloway's past. The trail led nowhere, because there was no record of a Captain Jonathan Holloway in the Continental Army. No officer by that name had fought at Yorktown or died in battle. The refined widow had walked into Richmond with a story built from air. While Hale was making his discovery, Ruth had set her sights on her seventh victim, Alexander Fitzhugh, one of Virginia's wealthiest merchants and a man whose wartime treachery had been particularly costly. Fitzhugh had used his role as a supplier to the Continental Army to pass convoy details to the British, leading to deadly raids on American supply lines. Her approach was the same, a calculated mixture of vulnerability and intelligence. Within 3 months, Fitzhugh proposed. But by now, Hale had whispered his suspicions to several prominent citizens, and warning voices began to reach the merchant's ear. 7 husbands, 7 graves, one friend warned. Even if it's just ill fortune, do you truly wish to be the 8th? Fitzhugh brushed the concern aside. Coincidence and gossip, he said. She's been examined, questioned, cleared every time. Are we to ruin a woman because fate has been cruel to her? What Fitzhugh did not know was that Ruth had already been studying him through stolen files, documents taken from Dr. Marcus Wainwright, the disgraced physician who had once been her supplier of poisons. Wainwright had uncovered the name of the old secret society linking her victims, the Covenant of Prosperity. They had traded intelligence with the British in return for post-war business power. Wainwright's knowledge made him dangerous, and Ruth tolerated his greed only until it became clear he wanted more money, more say, perhaps even a partnership in her work. That was his last mistake. One cold night in February 1791, Wainwright was found dead in his home, a victim of his own experimental medicine. The magistrate ruled it suicide. Ruth attended his funeral with somber dignity. Privately, she felt a great weight lift. The one man who could have tied her directly to her craft was gone. On March 15, 1791, Ruth became Mrs. Fitzhugh. The wedding was smaller than her earlier spectacles, but Captain Hale attended, watching her closely. 4 months later, Fitzhugh was dead. Another sudden illness beginning with stomach pain, ending in total collapse. Dr. Harrison examined the body with painstaking care, but the poisons she used left no evidence that 18th century medicine could detect. Publicly, he said nothing. Privately, he was sure. By now, Ruth's mourning had become a performance art. She fainted graveside, secluded herself for weeks, and emerged with a new air, more confident, more commanding. She was now one of the wealthiest women in Virginia, and she had reduced the Covenant of Prosperity to one remaining member. Hale expected that last target to be Dr. Harrison himself, but his investigation turned up something he had not foreseen. In captured British intelligence files, he found mention of a female agent known only as the Widow, a Loyalist operative whose husband had been executed by American forces. The name Jonathan Holloway was there, but as a British spy, not a patriot. He had been captured and hanged in 1779 after members of his own network betrayed him to save themselves. The Covenant of Prosperity had not been Ruth's enemies because they'd sided with the British. They had been her enemies because they had betrayed one of their own. Ruth was not avenging a patriot wronged. She was killing American heroes, men whose betrayal of her husband had ended a traitor's career. Her mission was not justice, it was treason by another name. Hale's discovery came as Ruth was setting her sights on the last and most dangerous man on her list, Governor Edmund Randolph, leader of the Covenant itself. Married, powerful and ambitious, Randolph was not a man easily swayed. Yet Ruth had placed herself in his orbit, meeting him at political gatherings, offering wit and insight in conversation, and presenting herself not as a vulnerable widow, but as a woman of means and influence. When Randolph's ailing wife died in the spring of 1792, Ruth withdrew from public view, letting time pass before she made her next move. Meanwhile, Hale requested a private meeting with the governor. He laid out everything: her false identity, the suspicious deaths, the web of wartime treason, the truth of her husband's past. But instead of alarm, Randolph seemed intrigued. "A woman," he said slowly, "who can eliminate 7 men of," standing without so much as a whisper reaching a magistrate. "Captain, perhaps you misjudge the value of such a person." Governor Randolph listened to Captain Hale's warning in silence, and when he finally spoke, it was with a tone that unsettled the veteran officer. "I appreciate your concern for my safety, Captain," he said, "but I believe you've misunderstood Mrs. Holloway's situation. If she has indeed been eliminating enemies of the state, men who betrayed their country during the war, then perhaps she has been performing a valuable service. Maybe it is time her contributions were recognized rather than viewed with suspicion." Hale left that meeting with a sense of dread. Not only had the governor dismissed his concerns, but he seemed almost eager to ally himself with the widow. Hale realized the danger immediately. If Randolph and Ruth joined forces, they could destroy anyone they chose, with the full power of the state to shield them. What Hale didn't know was that Randolph already knew the truth about Ruth Holloway, her real name, her marriage to the British spy Jonathan Holloway, and her long campaign of revenge. And he also knew something Ruth herself did not. She believed her list of enemies was complete at 8. But in Randolph's mind, there had been 9 members of the Covenant of Prosperity, and she had one last name to learn. That revelation came during a private dinner at the governor's mansion in June 1792. Ruth accepted the invitation, thinking it a romantic overture, but found herself across from a man who wasted no time in shattering the pretense. "Mrs. Holloway," he began evenly, or perhaps Mrs. Jonathan Holloway would be more accurate, "widow of the British agent executed for treason in 1779. I think we can drop the polite fiction and speak plainly." Ruth's hand twitched toward the small vial of poison hidden in her reticule. She stopped when she saw his expression. Not fear, but something closer to amusement. "I know about your campaign," Randolph continued. 7 members of the Covenant of Prosperity, all dead, and you've marked me as the 8th. But you're mistaken. There were 9. Ruth's composure cracked for the first time. "Who?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Captain Jonathan Hale," the governor said smoothly. "The man who has been circling you for months. He was the Covenant's intelligence analyst, the one who identified your husband as a liability and recommended his elimination. He's not investigating you out of some noble duty. He's afraid you'll learn the truth." The name landed like a blade between them. For over a decade, Ruth had been driven by the need to complete her revenge, believing herself only one kill away from peace. Now there was another. Randolph leaned back, eyes locked on hers. "You see, my dear, you need me alive more than you need me dead. Together, we could finish this." Ruth studied him in silence, her voice steady when she finally spoke. "And what assurance do I have that you won't betray me? You've done it before, to my husband, to the British, to your own conspirators." "Because we're bound by the same chain," Randolph said. "You know of my treason, I know of your murders. Mutual destruction keeps us both honest, but..." Ruth had already decided there would be no alliance. The meeting had given her exactly what she needed, the name of her 9th target, and now she intended to kill them both. What followed was a summer-long game of deception. Ruth appeared to accept Randolph's proposal, while secretly plotting his death alongside Hale's. The governor, believing he had secured a dangerous but useful ally, prepared his own plan to dispose of her once she had served him. Meanwhile, Hale, still unaware his name was on her list, pressed on with his investigation, gathering testimony from household slaves who had seen and heard things no one in Richmond's polite society wanted to acknowledge. By August 15th, 1792, exactly 9 years to the day after Colonel Fairfax's death, the trap was ready. Ruth invited both men to a private dinner at her mansion, presenting it as a meeting to discuss a lucrative joint venture. Each man accepted, convinced he was in control. The evening unfolded with perfect civility. Fine courses, polite conversation, and wine flowing freely. But beneath the surface, all three understood that this was no ordinary dinner. Ruth's poisons had never been so elaborate. Rather than a single dose, she had devised separate and distinct toxins for each man, their effects designed to appear as unrelated natural deaths. For Governor Randolph, she had chosen a slow-acting blend of foxglove and hemlock, masked in a rare French brandy brought out specifically for this night. The taste was rich, the aroma flawless, no trace of the death it carried. Captain Hale's fate, however, would be delivered by a far different hand. Ruth had designed a particularly elegant death for Captain Hale, one that would strike hours after he left her home. A thin layer of contact poison, brushed invisibly along the rim of his wineglass, would seep through the skin with every sip. By morning, he would be found in his own quarters, a victim of what doctors would call apoplexy. His death would appear tragic, but entirely natural. But what Ruth didn't know was that Governor Randolph had arrived at this dinner armed with more than charm. His network of servants and informants had been busy. They had tracked her late-night excursions to abandoned buildings, her quiet purchases of rare herbs, even the hidden room where she compounded her poisons. And most damning of all, they had found her journal, every formula, every name, every date. At the table, Randolph looked entirely at ease, wearing the smug calm of a man convinced he was in control. Hale, by contrast, seemed restless, distracted, something Ruth interpreted as perfect confirmation of her plan. One man who thought himself safe, the other growing wary but still blind to the full danger. The conversation that followed was a duel in slow motion. "I've always believed," Ruth said lightly as she set down the main course, "that those who betray trust deserve to face the consequences, no matter how much time has passed." Randolph's eyes gleamed. "Indeed, Mrs. Holloway, justice delayed is not justice denied, especially when patience makes the reckoning all the more complete." Hale shifted in his seat. "And yet," he said, voice tightening, "revenge, however justified it may feel, destroys more than it restores. That's why we have laws, to keep justice from becoming personal." Ruth's smile was thin as glass. "And what happens, Captain, when those laws are bent, owned, by the very people who deserve punishment?" In that moment, Hale understood. The talk was no philosophical exercise. This was her creed, and he was her target. Her hand gestured toward the library. "Gentlemen, let's continue this over brandy. I've something special to share with you both." They followed her, each aware, though in different ways, that the next room would decide the game. Ruth moved with deliberate grace, placing herself between the men and the only exit. The servants were gone, the windows shuttered, the curtains heavy enough to muffle a shout. She crossed to a gleaming sideboard where 2 crystal glasses waited. "Governor Randolph, you believe you've bent me to your will," she said evenly. "Captain Hale, you believe you've gathered enough evidence to see me hang, and you are both correct, yet fatally wrong." She turned, each hand holding a glass of amber liquid. "The truth is, neither of you will leave this room alive. Governor, you will die for leading the conspiracy that murdered my husband. "Captain, you will die for marking him for death." For the first time, Randolph's mask cracked. "You underestimate the consequences of killing a sitting governor. My death will not be ignored." Ruth laughed softly. "I've ended 8 powerful men without a single serious accusation. I leave no loose ends, Governor. What makes you think you're different?" Hale's instincts surged into action. He lunged. Ruth was ready. The contents of one glass flew into his face, not poison, but a burning irritant from Virginia's native plants. He reeled back, hands clawing at his eyes, half blinded by searing pain. Randolph saw his chance and rushed her, but she moved with a precision born of 13 years of planning. In a single pivot, she had a pistol leveled at his chest, an old, well-oiled piece taken from a victim long ago. "I don't think so, Governor," she said quietly. Her voice never wavered as she kept the barrel trained on him, her gaze flicking to Hale as he staggered upright. "Do you want the truth about your precious covenant of prosperity?" she asked, her tone edged with contempt. "It wasn't patriotism that bound you. It was greed. You sold information to whichever side paid more, switching allegiances like coats. My husband discovered your treachery, and you had him killed, not for liberty, but to hide your own crimes." Randolph's face drained of color. "Those records were destroyed years ago. You think so?" Ruth's smile was thin and lethal. "For 13 years I have hunted every scrap, every witness, every whisper. I know more about the covenant than any of you ever dared to. And tonight, I finish what I began." The Covenant's crimes went far beyond selling scraps of intelligence to the British. They had run a scheme of staggering ambition, profiting from both sides of the war. Supplies meant for Washington's army had been stolen, vital American positions sold to the enemy, and rivals quietly eliminated to preserve their monopoly on treachery. "My husband discovered it all in 1779, Ruth said, her voice as steady as a blade. "And instead of reporting it to the British, he tried to blackmail you. That was his mistake. You couldn't risk him exposing your secrets. You couldn't kill him outright without drawing suspicion. So you handed him to the Continental Army as a British spy, knowing patriot justice would do your work for you." Across the room, Hale's vision cleared enough to truly see her, and the truth she carried. His voice was almost a whisper. "Dear God, you weren't seeking justice for Loyalists. You wanted vengeance for the rot that killed him." Ruth's eyes gleamed. "At last, Captain, you understand. Jonathan was a British agent, yes, but he was also my husband, the father of the child I lost when I fled. Your conspiracy didn't just end his life, it took mine with it, everything I loved gone. You didn't just create a widow, you forged a weapon. What stood before them was no ordinary killer. Ruth Holloway had dismantled an entire shadow network, piece by piece, through patience, precision, and a surgical reading of human weakness. She didn't simply kill, she orchestrated her enemies' destruction, letting their own flaws become the noose. Randolph tried one last gambit. "Spare me, Mrs. Holloway, and I'll give you more than revenge. I'll give you power. With my connections and your talents, we could control not just Virginia, but Washington itself." Her reply cut the air. "You still don't see me, Governor. This was never about power, wealth, or a place at your table. It was about love. Love for a man you murdered. Love for the life you burned to ash. Power corrupts, you've proven that well enough. But love endures, and love demands satisfaction." The end came with the precision of a clock striking the hour. Ruth had set the stage for this night to tell a perfect story, one where her enemies killed each other. By morning, servants would find a scene that told itself. Governor Randolph sprawled in the library, a bullet in his chest, Hale's pistol in his hand. Hale on the floor, his face blistered, his skull fractured by the shattered weight of a crystal decanter. Furniture overturned, papers scattered, and Ruth, bound and gagged in a closet, rope burns marking her wrists and ankles. The picture of a survivor, freed by horrified servants, collapsing into sobs too broken to speak. When Dr. Harrison arrived, her story was flawless. Hale had come wild-eyed, accusing Randolph of treason, waving documents as proof. Voices rose, accusations sharpened. A gun appeared, glass shattered. She'd been dragged away, locked in darkness, then silence. The evidence matched. Her injuries looked genuine, and who could doubt the grief of a widow with such a record of loss? The case was closed before it began. Officially, 2 men had died in a tragic clash over long-buried wartime secrets. The evidence that might have damned the governor was nothing but ashes in the fireplace. No one knew those documents were Ruth's forgeries. No one knew the blinding compound on Hale's skin had been crafted to mimic an accident. No one knew she'd bruised and bound herself with the same cold skill she'd used to kill for over a decade. The covenant of prosperity was gone. Every last member. Her mission complete. Her fortune secure. Over the next months, she slipped from Richmond, society claiming her health was ruined. She sold the mansion, retreating to an elegant but quiet estate on the city's edge. There she played the part of a reclusive lady. But in the shadows, she became something more. Ruth's taste for control never faded. Over decades, she turned into a silent power broker, buying influence, collecting secrets, toppling rivals without a drop of blood in sight. She never remarried. Her companionship was reserved for senators, judges, and merchants who somehow always owed her favors they could never repay. When she died in 1834, age 80, the mask finally slipped. Hidden among her possessions was the complete record, names, dates, methods of 9 murders, and dozens more corrections she'd made to Virginia society. Blackmail, ruined careers, quiet disappearances. Her journals, written in a cipher that took months to break, told of a woman who saw herself as something beyond the law, justice without law, retribution without mercy, order without government. She hadn't stopped killing, only perfected it. Choosing her prey not for personal gain, but for a private code no court could sanction. She was no longer the widow who arrived in Richmond with a tragic story. She was a queen in the shadows, answering only to herself. The state sealed the journal. Too many names were still powerful, too many reputations would shatter. For nearly 2 centuries her story stayed buried in archives, whispered only among the few historians who stumbled upon it. Modern experts who've studied her methods agree Ruth Holloway was a century ahead of her time. A master of toxins, staged scenes, and manufactured narratives, techniques police wouldn't catch up to until the late 20th century. And perhaps her greatest crime was never the killings. It was how she convinced an entire society to protect her. For 50 years she lived inside their trust, cloaked in grief, lauded as a tragic beauty, while killing at will. Her legacy is a warning. The most dangerous predators don't lurk outside the walls, they sit inside, smiling, and learn to pull the levers.